Martin Scorsese is well aware that he's not the first person to dramatize the story of the Osage Reign of Terror, and that his forebears were not exactly the best example. David Grann's non-fiction book Killers of the Flower Moon ends by describing how the FBI, which arrived in Oklahoma years after the killings began, used the case to promote itself with an episode of the 1930s radio drama The Lucky Strike Hour. 2 decades later, J. Edgar Hoover himself participated in the Jimmy Stewart-led film The FBI Story, which contains a brief recreation of the Osage case. But it's the radio drama, produced a decade after the murders, that clearly stuck with Scorsese, and which provides the astonishing coda to his new film adapted from Grann's book. Over the course of nearly 3.5 hours, Scorsese meticulously unfolds the story of Molly Burkhart, Lily Gladstone, an Osage woman, and Ernest Burkhart, Leonardo DiCaprio, a white man who moves to Oklahoma. Ernest goes to work for his powerful uncle William Hale, Robert De Niro, and falls in love with Molly. The fact that Molly is entitled to vast wealth thanks to the oil deposits found on Osage land is, of course, not lost on Ernest. But even as it becomes clear that Ernest is conspiring with his uncle to not only seize the Osage's wealth, but using incredible violence to do so, Molly and Ernest's love holds fairly strong. As Scorsese pointed out in a recent New Yorker interview, even FBI agents at the time asked themselves why Molly stayed with Ernest. Scorsese's film attempts an answer, showing Ernest, a classic gutless weasel of a Scorsese character, torn between his fear of his uncle, his greed, and his genuine love for his wife. But none, of course, made it into the historical record, much less a self-serving radio drama backed by the FBI. As the film draws to a close, we see Ernest being convicted for his crimes against Molly's family and other Osage people, and watch Molly finally walk away from him, allowing herself to see for the first time just how deeply he's betrayed her. It's a personal, devastating scene focused on Molly and her agency, precisely the kind of thing left out of so many stories about Native Americans, and then Scorsese leaps boldly into the future. In the next scene, we see a cast of entirely white actors recreating the Osage story for a stage-produced radio drama, with the full benefit of Foley sound effects, a sonorous narrator, and a cheering crowd. In this version of the story, the FBI lawman Tom White, Jesse Plemons, a minor supporting character in the film, is the conquering hero, and the villains have been firmly dispatched. It is a cozy narrative conclusion to one of the last great dramas of the Wild West, and bears no resemblance to the story we've just seen unfold. As David Grann told in an interview, one of the things he tried to underscore in the book was how this history was distorted. And one of the things the Bureau did was, they tried to turn this into this big success after they had apprehended a few of the killers. But there was a much deeper and darker conspiracy that the Bureau never exposed. Then Scorsese himself arrives, stepping on stage and into a spotlight that takes the film out of the realm of reality. Taking the place of the radio drama narrator, he reads the part of the story that never made it into the Lucky Strike Hour, what happened to Molly, the heroine of Scorsese's version of the story. He reads the basic details of the rest of her life and her death in 1937. Scorsese's words, describing Molly's obituary, are the final ones we hear in the film. There was no mention of the murders. The Killers of the Flower Moon is a late-career corrective to the myths of violent men and criminal enterprises that Scorsese's films have helped promote despite his best intentions. In its attention to the Osage, a culture that has been willfully misrepresented and ignored by Hollywood, Killers might be Scorsese's most significant contribution yet to the cinematic historical record. His step into the spotlight in that final scene, offering one last bit of information, is an acknowledgement of what he's been able to add, but also of its limits. He's right there on the same stage as the radio drama, after all. In another 90 years, we may consider Killers as blinkered and biased as The Lucky Strike Hour. Scorsese seems perfectly aware that, as an Italian-American New Yorker making a film centered on Native Americans, he can only strive to be as comprehensive as possible. Grann's book also ends with that sense of uncertainty. After exploring in depth the story of Molly's family, the author acknowledges that there were dozens, if not hundreds, of murders in the Osage community that were never solved, but most likely were motivated by the same greed for oil money. Even the best historians can only get fragments of the story, even the best filmmakers can only tell the part they can see. The actual final shot of Killers is a dramatic overhead view of a present-day Osage gathering, a whirling and unbroken circle of dancers binding their community together. Scorsese has had his moment on the stage, and now the story goes back to the Osage people, where it belongs.